This one actually comes from another YouTube channel, popular geopolitics YouTube channel called Geopop.
And, I know those guys. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Great. Also Australian.
Yep.
Yes. And they're wondering, do you like Peter ZEIHAN? And what other analysts do you like?
I like lots of analysts, and it really depends on what I'm talking about. Peter ZEIHAN's a really interesting character. I think he's. I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus. I think a lot of his takes are good. A lot of them are a little bit far for my personal taste. I tend to favor more of the really boring, the people I love to listen to are the guys who've, let's say, worked, for the State Department doing Eastern Turkmenistan for 35 years. They are the most boring, awful people to have dinner with, but boy, God, do they know what's going on over there. They know the general's dog's name. They know what streets have potholes. Those guys are great, but they're very boring. I think Peter's a really, really good speaker and really good at actually putting across information. Again, it's one of those things that when Peter says something, he gets a good level of trust, but I tend to want a second or third source to kind of back things up.
Mm-hmm. So what other analysts do you like?
Again, it really comes down to what theater it is. So someone like, for instance, China stuff, Eric Gomez is always a really good go to me. I'm a big fan of guys like Sheena Greitens. She's really good for sort of China stuff. Stephen Pfeiffer's really good for Ukraine. Scott Rowland's really good for, wider geopolitics. Michael Ziegler's really good for Russian internal politics. Carl Schreck's really good for, domestic Russian politics. It really just depends on what theater. I have a kind of Rolodex that everyone's kind of put in their little special zones. And when, like my producer sort of hit me up this evening talking about doing sort of Russian money laundering in the UAE. And I went, okay, cool. And just went to like my usual Russian money laundering guys. And I was like, okay, let's see what you've got on this and go from there. So guys like Tom Burgess, for instance, is really, really good with that. Again, I just, because of the way the show is, where we're doing crazy deep dives for 2 weeks at a time, I am usually buried, like absolutely in my mind. That's all I'm thinking about for 2 weeks. I will get to know every single analyst for those 2 weeks, and then I won't think about, I will know the South America analytical community really well, and then I won't think about them again for about 8 weeks. As much as I love those guys, but yeah, it really is just depending on what I'm looking at the time.
Yeah. Well, that covers another question which people were asking. How do you pick your guests? Because it is amazing how tailored your guest list is to your topic.
Usually we try and do a bit of a narrative structure. Mm-hmm. So the first guest is often someone who's a bit more historical, can kind of give a bit of context. Mm-hmm. We kind of imagine everyone has a bit of geopolitical knowledge. But the first guest is usually kind of there to smooth stuff out. And then we kind of want a bit of contradictory guests. See, this is the trouble. If you have one guest, then you only get one opinion. Right. So we try and give guys who are all, we're not getting extremist people. We're not getting, a far left hippie and a far right conspiracy. We're not getting Alex Jones and, the vegan teacher on. We're not going to do that. But, guys who have slightly different viewpoints on things, whether it be, a more American point of view or a more a bit more gung-ho with their opinion. When you read analysts' work, some of them are a bit more hawkish, others are a bit more reserved, and we kind of try and get a bit that play off each other. So usually when we pick guests, myself and the staff will effectively go and pick our top 10, dream guests. That's who we really want. And effectively we'll start vetting them. So going through previous speeches, going through some of their work, seeing what their opinion's probably going to be. So by the time we actually sit down with them, we have a pretty good idea on what they're going to tell us. Some surprise us. There are some who, we can solve the Cyprus problem by simply sinking it into the sea. I'm like, oh, that is not going on the tape. But most of them you can generally tell what they're going to say. So effectively that's how we start to go, okay, here are our 3 kind of archetypes we want. So it'll be, we want someone who has probably lived through it, someone who understands the culture, someone who can tell us why this is important. We want someone who can give us a whole regional perspective. So they may not be, let's say, a Kosovo expert, but they'll be a Balkans expert. And then we'll probably have someone who will either give us the other side of it or will give us a, this is why it's happening. I don't agree with it, but here's the narrative, and try and build a story around it. Because again, you don't want just information for 90 minutes. That sounds... it sounds like a dictionary and tumble dryer at that point. What you want is a bit of a narrative to it where you can go, okay, I get the Yugoslav wars. Okay, I get why Kosovo has a hard time becoming independent. Oh, and now I get why China is actually putting money into this project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What topics are you following most closely right now?
My main work has been Central Asia and the former Soviet states. So I'm always buried in Central Asia stuff. So I get to pronounce all the most lovely names of all time, like Turkmenistan's former president, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov. I get to say that all the time. So Central Asia is always right in my purview. But generally, Ukraine is always taking up a lot of my time at the moment. But again, it comes down to that 2 weeks. So for instance, right now we are finishing up our cyber war in Ukraine piece. So I've been buried in cyber documents and lots of Ukraine stuff all week. And I'm just sort of getting into an episode we're doing on Turkish influence in the Middle East. So I've already started getting lots of Turkish papers on my desk, and my staff are getting briefing papers put together. And I'm, I think from tomorrow afternoon is when I officially switch from one episode to the other. So I will be pretty much pushing all the Ukraine stuff off my desk and just putting a bunch of Turkey on my desk. So again, it really comes down to what episode we're doing at the time. And we usually do about 3 episodes at a time. We have a cycle. Mm-hmm. So this will be the midway to the end of this cycle. And we're sort of, So 2 weeks ago, I was buried in aircraft carriers. This week, buried in computers and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. What country would scare you most to enter?
Ooh, that's a real interesting one. I'm not allowed in Israel because I've been to Iran and a few other places. Scare me the most? That's a really good question. I've never been asked that one. The Central African Republic's pretty rough at the moment. I don't think I feel particularly comfy in there, but I'd still go just out of curiosity. Democratic Republic of Congo, I think, is the only one I've knocked back a job offer for, because I had a friend of mine who runs a mine out there, and some of the stories and videos he's shown me are pretty horrific. I think even that would break my happy-go-luckiness. I'd say DRC is probably one of the only ones I'd feel that I would either have to, if I was going to go in, I want to know, that I have a good fixer and that I'm having protection and everything else. Whereas, put me in a lot of countries tomorrow and I'll muddle my way through it. But yeah, I think DRC would be the one I would draw the line at.
Sure. Yeah. Michael, what books are you reading?
Ooh, right now I am rereading On Grand Strategy because I've read that a couple of times, but I'm getting my head back into it. I'm about to start a book on Turkey, which I can't remember which one it is. I know it's just on my pile. I just finished, it's like the Indo-Pacific Strategy one by Rory Medcalf, which is really good. I've got Kevin Rudd's book somewhere around here. I said I'd read that for, I'll get to it eventually. But yeah, always a couple books on the go. And then, I can't remember what other, but those are the main ones I'm reading at the moment. It'll be Turkey, Asia, aircraft carriers. You can see the cycle where I'm kind of exiting one and getting into the other. But it's also not unusual that, again, the red line is a staff of 15 and my researchers are absolutely fantastic. And it's not unusual that they might say, hey, look, please read this book, chapters 12 to 16. That's the bit you need. Don't worry about the bit before. I know you'd find it interesting, but we don't need you to talk about Vanuatu this week. Just 14 to 16, and I'll end up just trying to peruse through them. So it really depends. But I'm also a giant audiobook guy. I'm constantly having an earpiece in. So yeah, if your book's on audiobook, you're about 10 times more likely for me to read it these days.
What books would be in your starter pack for people who wanted to get a sense of your work?
So the book I recommend to everyone to start with is The Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall. And Tim's lovely in person. He's the most sarcastic man I've ever met in my life, and I love him for it. In fact, he actually narrates some of his audiobooks, particularly his ones about him in the Balkans in the 90s were great. That's a really, really good place to understand the very basics of geopolitics. The idea that every country is kind of in it for themselves and they all have their own completely different, hand of cards dealt. This idea that someone like America was dealt a really, really good hand of cards. They've got great internal waterways that run north-south and east-west. They've got no one who's a big power anywhere near them. They've got 2 oceans to deal with, great farmland, multiple climate zones. It is the best possible hand of cards. And then you get Tajikistan, who was dealt the worst hand of cards, who is just a mountainous mess where nothing really works or grows. Every country is given this hand of cards, and they have to play the hand of cards they're dealt. Even something like Russia, which is this giant nation, only has like 4 walkable ports half the year. It's things like that you go, okay, wow, I didn't even think about that, and that completely shapes how you play the game. Because for Russia, for instance, their port problem, that makes huge impacts on everything to do with geopolitics. So I always, people ask me, where do you start in geopolitics? Tim Marshall's Prisoner's Geography is a pretty good crash course if you're going to go start there. And that'll give you an idea on branching from that.
Awesome. Well, Michael, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and for doing the thorough, careful work that you do. I really enjoy it.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm happy to come on anytime.